Karen from the HOA couldn't stand that I refused to follow their rules, so she took things too far, setting my mother's house on fire. But little did she know, her actions would lead to her own downfall. Aisha first noticed that the Homeowners Association, HOA, didn't like her from the moment she moved into her mother's house. It wasn't because she was a bad neighbor, and it wasn't because there was anything wrong with the house. The problem was that Aisha refused to follow all of the HOA's rules. The community where Aisha lived had a typical HOA structure. These organizations are known for making a lot of rules that can be hard to understand and follow. The HOA charged a lot of money for things that didn't seem important, and they had rules that didn't always make sense. The worst part was that the rules seemed to change based on what the president of the HOA wanted. Aisha didn't want to be part of this group. She didn't sign up for the HOA and made it clear that she wasn't interested. But that didn't stop the HOA from trying to make her follow their rules. At first, it was just letters asking her to join, but when she said no, things started to get more difficult. Aisha knew she wasn't the only one who felt this way, but she decided she wouldn't let them control her. The HOA president, a woman with a sweet voice but a cold and calculating gaze, didn't give up. She came to Aisha several times trying to convince her to join the HOA. She made it sound like a privilege to be part of the community and follow the rules. Aisha didn't trust her though. She had been clear from the beginning that she didn't want anything to do with the HOA. But the president didn't like hearing no, and she wasn't going to stop trying. At first, the problems were small but annoying. Aisha started getting strange fines for things that didn't make sense. Sometimes she would get fines for rules she had never even heard of. One day she noticed that her trash wasn't picked up, even though she had followed all the rules. It seemed like the HOA was purposely making things difficult for her. Then things got worse. Aisha woke up one morning to find her car being towed away for illegal parking. But Aisha knew she hadn't broken any parking rules. She looked around and saw that other neighbors who parked in the same area never had their cars towed. It was clear that the HOA was targeting her. This didn't surprise Aisha. She had seen these kinds of people before, people who think they can force others to obey just because no one has stood up to them. The HOA president thought that if she made Aisha's life hard enough, she would give in. But Aisha refused to bend. She knew what they were doing and wasn't going to let them win. One evening, after a long day of work, Aisha was relaxing at home when she suddenly smelled smoke. At first she thought it was nothing, but then the smell grew stronger. She rushed to the window and saw smoke coming from the direction of her mother's house. Panic set in. Aisha quickly ran outside and was shocked to see flames rising from the house. It was a terrifying sight. Without wasting any time, Aisha grabbed her phone and called the fire department. She could feel her heart racing as she tried to stay calm. She gave them the details and told them her mother's house was on fire. The fire had already spread fast and Aisha couldn't do anything to stop it. She watched in horror as the flames grew higher, consuming everything in its path. By the time the fire trucks arrived, it was too late. The fire was too strong and the house was already completely destroyed. There was nothing left but charred remains. Aisha stood there in shock, not believing what she was seeing. The place where her mother's memories had been created, where they had spent years living together, was now just ashes. As she stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened, she noticed the HOA president standing at a distance. She was watching the fire with an emotionless expression, her arms crossed. There was no shock, no sympathy on her face, just a cold look of satisfaction. Aisha couldn't believe it. The woman seemed pleased by what had happened. It felt like the HOA president had somehow been waiting for this moment. After the fire, Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She didn't believe it was an accident. The fire had spread too quickly, and everything seemed too planned. Aisha was sure the fire was set on purpose. She suspected arson. When the police arrived, she didn't hold back. She calmly told them, "I think this fire was intentional. I have strong reasons to believe it was arson." Aisha had years of experience as a lawyer, so she knew how to investigate things carefully. She wasn't going to wait for the police to figure it out. She wanted answers and she knew how to find them. First, Aisha talked to her neighbors to see if anyone had seen anything strange the night of the fire. Some neighbors didn't know anything, but others were nervous. One neighbor seemed uncomfortable when Aisha asked if they noticed anything unusual that night. "Well," the neighbor said quietly, "I heard footsteps like someone was walking near your house and I heard voices. It didn't sound normal. It sounded like someone was right outside." Aisha's heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of information she was looking for. Next, Aisha decided to check the security cameras. She knew that many houses in the neighborhood had cameras pointing toward the street. After asking around, one neighbor agreed to show her the footage. When Aisha watched the video, her heart raced. She saw 3 people walking toward her mother's house in the middle of the night. They were moving carefully, trying not to be seen. Aisha could see their faces were covered, but something about one of them caught her attention. One of the figures was wearing a shiny necklace. The necklace sparkled in the light from the street. Aisha instantly recognized it. It was the same necklace she had seen on the HOA president before. This was the proof Aisha needed. It wasn't just a random coincidence. She was sure now that the HOA president was involved in the fire. Aisha felt a mix of anger and determination. She had to make sure the truth came out. With this new evidence, Aisha knew she could push the police to take the case seriously and investigate further. As Aisha continued her investigation, everything began to fall into place. The evidence from the security footage was enough to confirm her suspicions. The HOA president had been involved in starting the fire. But that wasn't all she discovered. Aisha, using her experience as a state judge, also began looking into the president's actions with the HOA. What she found was shocking. It wasn't just arson. The president was also involved in serious financial crimes. Aisha knew the HOA had been charging high fees, but she didn't realize just how much money the president had been stealing from the residents. She found records of missing funds, unexplained expenses, and payments made to the president's personal accounts. It was clear that the HOA president was embezzling money from the community. Aisha's anger grew, but she stayed focused. She was going to make sure that the president paid for everything she had done. Using her position as a judge, Aisha was able to speed up the investigation. She made some calls and pushed for the police to dig deeper into the financial misconduct. In just a few days, the evidence was undeniable. The HOA president had stolen from her neighbors for years. She had been using her power to control the HOA and enrich herself. Aisha knew it was time to confront the president. She went to the HOA office and walked into the president's office, where she found the woman sitting behind her desk. The president looked up, her face showing no surprise. Aisha placed a folder full of evidence on the desk. "I thought you should see this before the police do," Aisha said calmly. The president's face turned pale as she leafed through the papers. She could see that Aisha had everything. It was the moment of truth. Aisha had made sure the president knew there was no escape. The police were already on their way, and now the president's fate was sealed. After Aisha presented the evidence to the HOA president, the police took over the investigation. They dug deeper into the case, looking at all the evidence Aisha had gathered. It didn't take long for them to find enough proof to arrest the president. She was charged with both arson and embezzlement. The community was shocked, but Aisha wasn't surprised. She had known all along that the president was guilty. Once the news spread that the president had been arrested, the HOA, which had once been feared by everyone in the neighborhood, began to fall apart. The president had held so much power for years, but now her control over the community was gone. The people who had once been afraid of the HOA president now felt free. They started to speak out, sharing their own stories about how she had abused her power. Neighbors who had stayed quiet before now openly talked about the corruption and unfair rules she had forced on them. People began to realize how much they had been controlled by the HOA. The president had used the association to bully others, forcing them to follow her rules and pay unfair fees. Many neighbors admitted they had been too scared to stand up to her before, but now they were ready to fight back. They began to demand change, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a place where they could speak their minds. As the HOA crumbled, people started to take back control of their community. The president's empire had fallen, and Aisha had played a key role in making sure she was held accountable for her actions. The neighborhood was no longer under the thumb of a corrupt leader. Aisha had not only exposed the truth but had also helped free her community from years of fear and control. Once the police arrested the HOA president, the news didn't stay quiet for long. The local media quickly picked up the story. Headlines started to appear in the newspapers, exposing the president's criminal activities. People were shocked to learn how much money she had stolen from the neighborhood and how she had tried to burn down Aisha's mother's house to force her into joining the HOA. The president, who had once been feared by everyone, was now the subject of public outrage. As the investigation into her crimes continued, more and more people came forward with stories about how the president had treated them unfairly. Neighbors who had been too scared to speak before now felt empowered to share their experiences. The truth about her corrupt actions became clear to everyone. The HOA president's life started to fall apart. Her house, which had once been a symbol of her power and control, was put up for sale. The money from the sale was going to be used to pay back some of the money she had stolen from the residents. But that wasn't enough to fix the damage she had caused. The president lost everything: her house, her position, and her reputation. She had no one left to protect her. The neighborhood, which had once been controlled by the president's rules, was now free. People no longer had to live in fear of her. The HOA was dissolved, and the ridiculous fines and unnecessary rules disappeared. For the first time in years, the community felt like a place where everyone had a voice. They no longer had to live under the thumb of a corrupt leader. Aisha's courage had changed everything. She had exposed the truth, and in doing so she had helped set the neighborhood free from tyranny. Aisha looks back at everything that happened. The HOA tried to destroy her. They tried to force her into joining their group, and when she refused, they made her life difficult. They even set her mother's house on fire to break her spirit. But in the end, it wasn't Aisha who was destroyed, it was the HOA president and the whole association. Aisha never gave up, and in the end, justice was served. The president was arrested, the HOA was dissolved, and the neighborhood was free. The people who had once lived in fear now felt empowered. They didn't have to follow unfair rules anymore. Aisha's final words were clear: the HOA's greed and abuse led to their downfall. They tried to break me, but instead they brought their own end. Now, the community is a better place for all of us.